For our next topic of the course, we'll be discussing racialized slavery in 17th century Virginia. And arguably, this is the most important, the most consequential event that we'll be discussing in this course. It's probably going to rival that of the American Revolution in terms of its impact on American civilization, so to say. But yeah, the turn from indentured servitude as a primary labor force in Virginia towards that of African slaves to replace them on the plantation system is going to wield enormous and profound changes in the ensuing decades and centuries. It's going to affect our, of course, social relations, more specifically racial relations. But of course, it's going to shape our economy. It's going to affect our political ideologies, of course, our culture. And the ripple effects would travel far into the future. In fact, today, it should be fairly obvious that we are still dealing with the effects of this fateful decision made by some Virginia planters to engage in the slave trade, right? The effects are seismic once again. And if you look at this depiction before you, it's an illustration of an English slave trader, but you'll also notice that he's negotiating with an African slave trader. And behind the African slave trader are some captives that are, of course, going to be sold into slavery, and they're going to travel across the Atlantic to the New World. So this illustrates something important, that Africans themselves, African slave traders on the African continent, that is, were involved in the selling of other Africans. All right. And we'll talk about this. This is called the triangular trade system, which involved Europe going down to Africa to sell certain desirable commodities to Africans in exchange for these captives to be brought over across the Atlantic to the New World. Okay, now a constant theme in this course is the transition in an economic sense from feudalism to capitalism. Now, it should be obvious to us that in capitalism, the labor force, the labor source, does not involve slavery at all. And not only that, the modern worldview, the modern mentality basically finds slavery as morally reprehensible, if not just archaic and out of fashion, right? That's something people did in the old days. We don't do it today in the modern world. Now, let's also remember that Virginia had established an economic system based on a monocrop agricultural system. And, that's fairly obvious that they're producing, therefore, for the market. This is not subsistence farming. This is producing solely for the market. In other words, it's modern. It's based on modern capitalism. So there is an anomaly here because slavery does not fit in capitalist enterprises in terms of labor. Okay. Even today, the main way you're gaining your labor, right, is through paying them wages. You have wage laborers or perhaps salaried employees, right, that constitute the labor force in a modern capitalist enterprise. Well, look at this instance, however, in Virginia. You have something that doesn't fit. In other words, you have slavery coming into a capitalist system. Okay, so this is one thing that's going to define slavery in the New World, not just in North America, but even the Caribbean and parts of Central and South America. Okay, namely because the impetus that's undergirding the slave trade from Africa is ultimately profit. So that's something new in terms of slave formations. And we'll discuss that further in the course. but this is something that we should constantly think about. Okay, so another thing to take notice of is the sheer amount of migration happening from Africa to the New World. In fact, for many decades, you're going to see many more Africans crossing the Atlantic from the Old World to the New World, so to speak, than Europeans themselves. Okay, some historians have come up with statistics whereby it's believed that 12.5 million African slaves are going to be brought to the New World. Now, this is also very important to note. They're not all going to North America. In fact, only a small percentage of them will wind up in, say, Virginia or the Carolinas and eventually Georgia and so forth. Most of them actually will end up going to the Caribbean, where they'll work under different European empires, the French, the Dutch, the English, and Spanish, and so forth. Okay. In fact, 46% of the slaves will be sent to the Caribbean. 45 will be sent to just one colony itself, and that's the colony of Brazil, that's run by the Portuguese. And then you'll see about 5% going to Spanish territories, and the remaining 4% will end up in North America, in places like Virginia and the Carolinas. So again, a small percentage. But of course, what we're going to see is that on the eve of the Civil War, you'll have nearly 4 million slaves in America, despite the fact that we ended our slave trade with Africa by 1808, and I'll discuss that in a future lecture. But look at that, even 5 decades later, we'll see a considerable jump in population. And this is due to something called racialized slavery. This is the title of this topic, racialized slavery. It's a concept that I will discuss shortly. Okay, so this is what we have to take notice before we jump right into this topic of racialized slavery. The fact that the slave trade is actually quite immense. It does not simply involve the English going to North America. In fact, a small percentage actually is involved in North America. And it also is immersed in the capitalist modern economic system. Okay, and again, that's an anomaly. It's something that, in other words, does not really fit. And some historians argue that really what explains the Civil War in a structural sense is basically this feudal system in the South that utilizes slave labor clashing with industrial labor in the North that utilizes wage labor. And they're both expansionist, and in a structural sense, they're going to collide within this finite area we call the United States of America. And it just so happens that the North, the industrial North that is, won that war. Okay, that's a topic for a future lecture, of course, for a future period. So now we need to discuss some important distinctions here. So let's recall the event of Bacon's Rebellion that we discussed with the last topic, early English settlement. Now this, if you remember, was a class-based rebellion. That is to say, it was a conflict between the Virginia elites, the plantation owners, the governors, and the English servants and the poor. So yes, it was a social, or rather socio-economic conflict, right? To use a more modern term. There was a conflict between the haves and have-nots, to use a more older term, right? And in this case, the English indentured servants identified with African slaves here, more so than with the English elite. So in other words, social class mattered the most to them, right? That's why they identified with African servants, because they were in the similar circumstances of being exploited and being mistreated. They're set in the same ditch, so to speak, right? So they formed this coalition and started this revolt, which of course did not succeed, but nonetheless, it did arouse the fear of the elite in Virginia. And as we discussed, they found ways to deal with the possibility of another rebellion by dividing and conquering the labor force. Okay, now what we see happening with Bacon's rebellion is that Virginia was a society with slaves. So here I could draw your attention to the slide itself. An important distinction arises here. That is to say, that of a society with slaves versus a slave society. Now notice, both societies do have slaves. Okay, in both societies, slavery is indeed legal, but it is still important to distinguish the two. How do you do this? Well, as indicated on the slide, a society with slaves is one whereby slave labor is not the primary labor source. So when we think about Virginia, it's obviously the case, as we discussed, that indentured English servants comprised the primary labor source before Bacon's rebellion, right? African servants, or slaves, to be more accurate, were definitely greatly outnumbered by indentured servants. Okay, so due to the fact that slave labor is not the primary labor source, you therefore see more flexibility, more fluidity in the status of actual slaves in that society. In fact, I made note of this, that once African slaves came over to Virginia, most of the masters tended to treat them the same way they treated their indentured servants. Why was this the case? Well, it's largely due to the fact that there's no legal precedent, not to mention any customary precedent on how to treat slaves. Again, there was no slave laws brought from brought from England to Virginia, because there was no slavery in England. All right, so as we'll see, they kind of had to make it up on their own. Again, going to Virginia society before Bacon's rebellion, it's primarily a servant society, where 80% of the population were comprised of indentured servants. So, due to this fact, you see slaves actually enjoying some freedoms, some rights. For example, it was permissible to get married if you're an African slave, to even own land. Many of them, actually not many of them, but quite a few number of them even were able to gain their freedom. Why? Because there was no slave law that said slavery is perpetual from cradle to grave. Okay, so again, indentured servants tend to be freed after, under normal circumstances, say 7 and 8 years. So a Virginia master might do the same, right? Okay, so slaves had some rights, right to get married, right for even freedom, to own even land. There was the famous example of Anthony Johnson, a freed slave in early Virginia. He won his freedom, and not only that, he went on to gain land, become wealthy, and even own other African slaves. Okay, now that was not the usual case. It was sort of a dramatic instance, and the reason why we still talk about him today is because this is something that's very unusual, right? And you wouldn't think that could happen, right, in Virginia. So this brings up an important point. Why did this happen? It's because it was still a society with slaves in Virginia. So let's oppose that to a slave society. This is a case where obviously slave labor is indeed a primary labor source. So because of this, owners and masters wanted to make sure to control their slaves. You don't want to give them too much freedom. In fact, you should probably negate all their freedoms in totality. And this was done with the overarching slave codes. You know, what you do is compile the various slave laws that come up through the decades, put them all together, add some new ones, and you come up with an overarching slave code, which basically defines your society as a slave society. Okay, now, the slave codes means that slaves have no rights. In fact, it's stated in the negative. That is to say, you know, slaves cannot do this, cannot do that, X, Y, Z. It never says slaves have the right to A, B, and C, right? They have no rights, for the most part, all right? Now, because of this, what we see characteristic among slave societies is a very rigid racial hierarchy, whereby, of course, white masters are at the top, and then you have even poor farmers who own no slaves, who are English and later American, right? They'll be in the middle, and then you'll see at the very bottom slaves, and it's rigid. Again, slaves cannot move up to the top, okay? So the fact that they are slaves and of African descent, means that they are relegated to the very bottom, the bottommost rungs of a slave society's hierarchy. Okay, now, Anthony Johnson, that slave who went on to own other African slaves, he could not do this in a slave society, or if Virginia was, in fact, a slave society. That should be obvious. In fact, Bacon's Rebellion could not happen if Virginia was a slave society rather than a society with slaves. So it's important to note that. This is why this distinction is important to draw up, because what we'll be discussing for this new topic is the transition of Virginia from a society with slaves towards a slave society, which means indentured servants are going to be replaced by African slaves. And obviously it will be the case where slave societies will expand southward and westward, and even after the formation of the United States of America, we'll see slavery still exist in the southern states. Of course, we have the enormous crucible of the Civil War, which ends this course, right? But again, this should hopefully underline to you the crucial consequences that we associate with this event of Virginia transforming towards a slave society. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide or the next video.